Hi, everybody. So this is kind of a part two. Part one was I can't take echinacea because I have an autoimmune disease. And now we're going to get into a little bit more of the science of why people say that and kind of debunking this. And it's a little thing called TH1 and TH2. So these are two cells in your immune system that live forever on a seesaw. When one goes up, the other one goes down, and vice versa. So you get this nice pendulum seesaw action. And at any given time, you can have one or the other. And the two cells are good at different things. TH2 cells are really good at fighting parasites, and they're good at like allergies and expelling things on a river of mucus. That's what TH2 is good at. And they communicate with and boss around other cells in the immune system, like eosinophils, and basophils, and mast cells, and B cells, and plasma cells. And all of those cells, they kind of are buddy-buddy with this side of the equation. Then on the other side of the equation, you have your TH1 cells. And TH1 cells are buddy-buddy with like macrophages and natural killer cells. And they are really good at fighting viruses, bacteria, and to some extent cancer, and to some extent yeast. So if you think about it, those are more commonly what we encounter in day-to-day life. Certainly if you travel abroad, you might pick up a parasite, but TH2 doesn't come in quite as handy on a day-to-day basis. It's really TH1 that's going to be more useful in the in and outs. But the same goes, and I think Datis Karazian, the big thyroid guy, he was the one that really popularized this idea in the autoimmune world first. And the idea was that if your TH1, TH2 teeter-totter is skewed, that will cause autoimmunity, which I don't agree with. But the reasoning also was that there's a lot of diseases that if you Google it, you look it up, there's websites with lists, and they'll say that they're TH1 dominant diseases, which means hypothetically that the seesaw is already pushed too far in the direction of TH1. And that's the argument against echinacea and against, elderberry and these TH1 stimulating herbs is if your seesaw is already here and this side is already hyperactive, then you don't want to push it further by taking echinacea. That could be a bad thing. And theoretically, if that is the case, that could be a bad thing. But I would argue that this scenario is way, way, way less common than this scenario. And here's where some of the fun gets rolling too, is you look back and you go, well, okay, let's say that everybody who said this is full of crap. Just ride with me on this one. Everybody's full of crap. They don't know what they're talking about. Why would they get confused? Like researchers have hypothesized that diseases are TH1 dominant, so why would they make that mistake? And the reason for it is science. The beauty and the curse of science is that you only know what you know at this given time, and as the science progresses, then we have to deal with how to use that new information later. So back up until about, I think it was 2008, we didn't know that a type of white blood cell existed. And what it was, you have these TH17 cells, and they look very much alike with TH1 cells. So these two cells look very similar. They share a receptor, which is why we got confused by them, rather they share half of a receptor. But they look very similar, and they can both do inflammatory stuff, and they share half a receptor. So for the longest time, what was happening is that these TH17 cells were doing all the inflammatory mischief and tissue damage and destruction, but they looked like TH1, and we only knew about TH1, so TH1 cells got all the blame up until about 2008. And it's still 10 years later taken us up until now to really figure out that A, that those cells exist and they are the real problems with autoimmunity, but B, that it was TH1 that was inadvertently blamed for TH17's mischief. So when people hypothesized that the seesaw was like this, what they didn't realize was that it didn't have as much to do with the seesaw in and of itself. It was this other type of cell that was getting into squirrely mischief making. And those are truly inflammatory cells. Now, we'll talk about them in another time because they do have a purpose and they're not intrinsically bad, but they are intrinsically very inflammatory. And once they get turned on, it can be hard to turn that cycle off. But with reference to the seesaw, what I see much more frequently is a lot of my autoimmune people have chronic bacterial, viral, fungal infections, cancer, things that TH1 is really well equipped to deal with. And as time goes on and your immune system becomes dysregulated and suppressed, the seesaw starts to tip this way. And you start getting more allergies and phlegminess and like weird squirrely histamine stuff with your autoimmunity. And that TH1 system is gradually becoming fatigued because it's inefficient at fighting a pathogen that it can't fully get rid of, or you're so nutritionally depleted that it can't fight anymore. So I would say that this is a lot more common, in which case things like echinacea, elderberry, things of that nature are going to be really marvelous and frankly critical at boosting that side of the immune system so that you have a fighting chance to fight your viruses, to fight your bacteria, to fight these infections, and to ward off cancer. But like I said, we'll talk about TH17 later, but the long and short of it is the TH1 mediated diseases most likely are not TH1 mediated. There are some people for whom that's an issue, but they're much more few and far between than we ever realized. And I think that the other way is much more common. But take it with a grain of salt when you see on like AIP blogs or even functional medicine blogs. Just keep in mind that oftentimes clinicians and nutritionists aren't fully versed in this immunology and on the history of how this all happened. But TH1 largely is going to be your good guy and your friends. It's TH17 that you really need to look out for. So take the echinacea, but maybe watch out for the inflammatory triggers that'll get TH17 going.